He escaped slavery, but freedom didn't make him safe. It made him hunted. So why did he keep speaking? Tonight, we follow Frederick Douglass, a man who taught himself freedom through letters and then carried that freedom into halls of law and government. You are listening to Night History Story. Please subscribe and comment a topic you would like next. Now, let the years unfold in quiet chapters, from Maryland shores to printed pages that still hold the shape of a determined voice. Chapter 1. Maryland Beginnings. In February 1818, Frederick Bailey was born in Talbot County, Maryland, in a landscape of small farms and wide water. The roads were dirt, the fences were rough rails, and the air often carried the damp smell of the Chesapeake. Records of his earliest days are incomplete, yet the place is clear enough, with cabins, barns, and the long routine of work that began before childhood could feel secure. His mother, Harriet Bailey, lived under the same system, but was kept at a distance, and later chroniclers said she sometimes traveled to see him when she could. A child might notice a doorway, a blanket, or a worn wooden stool more than any legal term, and Douglass later remembered the sharp fact of separation. In the quiet of an indoor corner, with dim light on rough boards, he learned that family ties could be treated like movable property. In those early years, he lived for a time with his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, on the edge of the plantation world. The cabin had plain tools, a small hearth, and a simple bed, and the steady sound was the scrape of work, even when the room was still. In that setting, a child also learned the geography of power, because riders, messengers, and overseers moved along certain paths, as if the paths belonged to them. Douglass grew up in the orbit of Captain Aaron Anthony, who managed the estate of Colonel Edward Lloyd, a large planter with wide fields and formal routines. The great house at Y House stood apart, with its yard and outbuildings, and the distance between that house and the quarters was a visible measure of rank. Even a child could read the meaning of a ledger book or a whip handle hanging near a doorway, and the air around such objects felt tense, even when no one spoke. As he began to move among different workspaces, he observed how food, clothing, and shelter were distributed. Cornmeal, salted meat, and coarse cloth were ordinary objects, and the touch of rough fabric on skin became part of daily memory. In later life, he described these things without ornament, as if the plainness itself explained the order that surrounded him. He also learned that his own origins were treated as uncertain by design. He knew the name Harriet Bailey, but he did not have a stable account of his father, and he later wrote that a white man was widely assumed. In a world where names were written on paper for some people and withheld from others, that uncertainty was another kind of control, like a door that never fully opened. Around 1826, still young, he was sent away from the rural plantations toward Baltimore. The change meant streets, docks, and brick buildings, and it also meant new risks and new possibilities. As the cart rolled over uneven ground, with the smell of river water and tar not far away, the first great turning point was already taking shape, even if the child did not yet have words for it. Chapter 2. Baltimore Letters. By the late 1820s, Douglass was in Baltimore, in a busy port city, where masts and rigging crowded the skyline. The neighborhood near the water had narrow lanes, warehouses, and the constant presence of rope, barrels, and ship paint. The soundscape was different too, with carts on cobbles and voices from the docks. And in that new texture of life, he came to the household of Hugh Auld and Sophia Auld. Sophia Auld began to show him letters, using a book or paper as a guide, and the lesson was small and direct. A child looking at the page could see shapes, lines, and repeated marks, and the quiet scratch of a finger tracing an alphabet could feel like a secret door. Then, as Douglass later told it, the teaching stopped after Hugh Auld objected, and the sudden change only clarified that literacy was treated as dangerous. That stopping point became a turning point of its own. Douglass watched the household rules as closely as any printed line, and he began to seek knowledge in the spaces that were not meant for him. In a kitchen corner, with a scrap of chalk or a bit of slate, he practiced forming letters while the room carried the ordinary smell of bread and soap. He also learned from the streets. He traded small services and bits of bread with local boys in exchange for help with reading, and he studied signs, labels, and any newspaper he could hold. The paper itself was an object of fascination, with folded columns and dark ink, and he trained his eyes to move steadily across lines in the uncertain indoor light of a crowded room. In those years, he found the Columbian Orator, a book of speeches and dialogues used for teaching reading and rhetoric. It had printed arguments, structured paragraphs, and examples of how to build a case, and he absorbed its method as much as its words. The feel of a bound book, the thickness of pages, and the quiet rustle of turning leaves became part of how he learned to think in public form, as if each page were practice for a future audience. Baltimore also brought him close to shipyards and to the skilled trade of caulking, where seams in wooden holes were packed and sealed. Tools, mallets, and fibers were arranged in workmanlike order, and the smell of tar lingered on hands and clothing. Douglass began to see how labor could create value that was then claimed by others, and he also saw that skill could be a kind of leverage, even under constraint. The city held contradictions that he never forgot. It offered libraries, church meetings, and printed news, yet it also enforced the same system with patrols, papers, and fear of punishment. In that tension, with window light glinting off wet cobblestones after a rain, Douglass kept building a mind that could argue as well as endure, line by line. In Baltimore, Frederick Douglass turned scraps of paper, street signs, and a worn book into a quiet classroom, learning that literacy was treated as a threat. The shipyard tools and the smell of tar taught him another lesson, that skill could create value even when it was claimed by someone else. Soon, the scene shifts back to the eastern shore, where that growing inner strength is tested under closer control. Chapter 3. The Breaker. In 1833, Douglass was sent from Baltimore back toward Maryland countryside, to the town of St. Michael's on the eastern shore. The streets there were smaller, the buildings simpler, and the pace was slower than the port city, but the rules were no less strict. He came under the authority of Thomas Auld, and the change meant more field labor and closer supervision, with the scent of soil and cut stalks hanging in the air. By early 1834, Thomas Auld hired him out to Edward Covey, a farmer known for breaking the will of young enslaved men. Covey kept a close watch, and the work stretched across fields and fences, with morning mist and sweat on the same skin. Douglass later described a period of harsh treatment that aimed to make him feel small, using routine and violence as tools, and he remembered how the mind could begin to shrink when every movement was watched. In that pressured year, Douglass reached for help in the limited ways available. He sought counsel from Sandy Jenkins, an older enslaved man who offered spiritual comfort and practical advice, and Douglass later wrote about a root given as a talisman. This object itself, carried in a pocket, is less important than the human exchange around it, the quiet effort to steady a mind when the world insisted on unmaking it. The turning point came in August 1834, when Douglass resisted Covey in a physical struggle that Douglass later framed as the return of selfhood. He did not describe it to glorify violence, but to mark a boundary, like a line drawn on a page, with dusty ground underfoot and hard breathing in the close air. In the aftermath, he said the beatings from Covey stopped, and the simple fact of waking up without the same immediate dread was a change he could feel in his bones, even as the fields looked the same. After Covey, he was hired to William Freeland, a man considered less severe, and Douglass joined other enslaved men in planning an escape. The plan used paper passes and careful timing, and the tools were ordinary: a pen, a scrap of writing, a remembered route. In April 1836, the plot was discovered, and Douglass and others were jailed in Easton, where iron bars and stone walls made the air feel still and close. He was eventually sent back to Baltimore, and the return was another pivot. The city meant work in shipyards again, and it meant proximity to free black people and to the small networks of mutual help that existed despite law and threat. In the steady rhythm of tools on wood, with tar smell and harbor breeze, Douglass held on to the knowledge that he had not been broken, and that knowledge would soon demand action. Chapter 4. A Name in Motion. In the late 1830s, Baltimore was a place of crowded streets and waterfront labor, where enslaved and free workers moved among the same warehouses. Douglass worked as a caulker, handling mallets and fibers, and he learned how quickly wages could be taken from him, because his earnings belonged to his enslaver by law. The coins and paper notes he could not keep were tangible proof that freedom had a price placed on it, even in a busy yard that smelled of pitch. During this period, he met Anna Murray, a free black woman who worked and saved money in Baltimore. She understood the practical risks of escape, and she chose to help, offering clothing and savings, and even selling a feather bed according to some accounts. The objects were simple: a sailor outfit, a small bundle of necessities, and in their quiet preparation, the turning point became a plan with edges and seams. On September 3, 1838, Douglass escaped by traveling north by rail and water, moving through places like Wilmington and Philadelphia as the route allowed. The journey was rapid and uncertain, with tickets, timetables, and a constant need to appear ordinary among strangers. He reached New York City and the home of the abolitionist David Ruggles, where a room, a chair, and a locked door could feel like the first stable shelter. Anna Murray followed him to New York, and on September 15, 1838, they married, with a black minister officiating. Their new household began with a few belongings and a shared resolve, and the texture of cloth and the clink of dishes became part of building a life. Soon, they traveled to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a whaling town with cobbled streets and the smell of salt air, seeking work and anonymity. In New Bedford, they stayed for a time with Nathan and Polly Johnson, black residents who assisted new arrivals. Douglass adopted the name Frederick Douglass there, drawing it from literature as later accounts suggest, and the new name gave him a way to move without the immediate chain of a known identity. The act of signing a name on paper, even in plain ink, was a small ceremony of self-definition. The early months of freedom were fragile. Douglass worked when he could, sometimes returning to caulking, and he attended meetings that sharpened his understanding of the larger movement against slavery. In a modest church interior with wooden benches and quiet indoor light, he listened, learned, and began to sense that his own story might be used as a tool, not for display, but for argument. By 1841, he traveled to Nantucket, Massachusetts, for an anti-slavery convention, and there he was urged to speak. The hall held rows of chairs, a lectern, and attentive faces, and his voice carried experience into public air. This moment began his public life, and it placed him in the abolitionist network, where admiration and expectation could both press on him, like a hand on the shoulder that did not always know its own weight. After that first season of speaking, Douglass returned to modest lodgings and the practical work of travel. A trunk with pamphlets, a coat folded over a chair, and a notebook with penciled routes became familiar objects. The movement itself between town halls and railroad depots trained him to turn private memory into public testimony without losing control of the pace, even when the air in a crowded carriage felt close. After the struggle on the Eastern Shore and the failed escape plan, Douglass returned to Baltimore with a mindset on motion and a future not yet named. With Anna Murray help, he slipped north through rail and water, then built a fragile household where a new surname on paper meant a new life in practice. Now his freedom begins to take a public shape, as meeting halls, trunks, and lecture notices pull him toward a wider stage. Chapter 5. The Lecturer and the Page. In the early 1840s, Douglass moved through Massachusetts and beyond as a lecturer, traveling by train, carriage, and on foot as routes allowed. Meeting halls and churches became familiar interiors, with podiums, plain windows, and the soft shuffle of coats as audiences settled. He worked with William Lloyd Garrison and the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he was often introduced as a living witness, a role that gave him reach but also risk. Garrison admired the force of his testimony, and Wendell Phillips, another abolitionist orator, offered support in the world of public debate. Yet, Douglass also felt pressure to fit a narrow image of how a formerly enslaved man should sound and think. He responded by reading more, writing more, and refining his arguments, treating each speech like a document that could withstand scrutiny, with the steady smell of paper and ink always near. In 1843 and 1844, he joined larger tours, sometimes called the 100 Conventions Project, where abolitionists held repeated meetings across regions. The work required endurance and planning, and the tools were printed handbills, travel trunks, and schedules written in a tight handwriting, with the smell of coats and travel dust in crowded rooms. Douglass learned how a movement operated in practice, not only in principle, and he learned how quickly opposition could gather, sometimes forcing him to leave a town with little more than his notes in his pocket. By 1845, he decided to publish a full account of his life in slavery, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The manuscript was a stack of pages with careful sentences, and publishing it meant naming people and places in a way that made identification possible. The book increased his authority, but it also increased danger because it could help an enslaver or a legal agent trace him. And Douglass chose the risk because evidence on paper could travel where a voice could not. The book circulated in abolitionist circles and beyond, and Douglass became more than a speaker. In parlors and reading rooms, people held the volume in their hands, turning pages in quiet indoor light, and the physical object became part of a public case against slavery. Douglass kept moving, still speaking, still listening, and still measuring how words could become policy when they were repeated with discipline. In 1845, he left the United States for Britain and Ireland, partly to expand the cause and partly to reduce the immediate risk of capture. The ship crossing meant cramped quarters, salt air, and the steady motion of water under wood and canvas. When he stepped onto foreign docks, he carried his name, his book, and a new awareness that the world was larger than any one law, even as those laws still reached for him. Chapter 6. Across the Atlantic. From 1845 into 1847, Douglass traveled through Britain and Ireland, speaking in the cities where factory smoke and stone buildings framed the streets. He addressed audiences in halls with bright indoor light, balconies, and long benches, and he found that many listeners responded to his arguments with respect that felt different from the daily racial assumptions of the United States. The change was not perfect or universal, yet he later described a sense of breathing room, as if the air around his shoulders had loosened. In Ireland, he encountered the political leader Daniel O'Connell, who opposed slavery and colonial oppression in his own rhetoric. Douglass listened and learned how a mass movement could speak of rights in a broad register, using public meetings and printed pamphlets. The paper culture of reform was visible everywhere, with posters on walls and newspapers in shop windows, and Douglass absorbed both the content and the method. In Britain, Douglass connected with abolitionists such as George Thompson and a network of supporters who arranged lectures and lodging. Rooms where he stayed often held simple furniture, a writing desk, and the quiet comfort of not needing to hide his face from every stranger. He wrote letters, revised ideas, and watched how international attention could shift the balance of power, because his story now had witnesses across the ocean. He also watched daily life in streets and homes, noticing details that were not grand but were revealing. A hotel register, a theater ticket, or a seat on a public conveyance could show how a society handled the presence of a black visitor. And Douglass compared these experiences with the routines of segregation and insult he knew in the United States. The contrast gave him a stronger sense of what could be demanded, and he carried that thought quietly, like a folded letter in an inner pocket. During this tour, supporters raised funds that helped Douglass secure legal freedom from the claim of his former enslaver, with records indicating a purchase was arranged through intermediaries. The transaction itself reflected a bitter irony, yet it also altered the immediate legal danger he faced if he returned, and it left a trail of letters and receipts marked with dark ink. Money, receipts, and letters passed hands, and Douglass treated these documents as part of the practical world he had to navigate, even when the principle behind them felt wrong. By 1847, Douglass returned to the United States with renewed confidence and with financial support from abroad. He chose to build an independent platform through print, not only through lecturing. The decision marked a widening of his role from witness to strategist, and it required a new kind of daily work, with ink on fingers and type in trays. He traveled to Rochester, New York, a city shaped by canals, mills, and reform networks. In a church basement and later in office rooms, he began to assemble the tools of a newspaper, including a press, paper stock, and the small metal letters that formed sentences. The quiet click of type pieces and the smell of fresh ink made the work tangible. And Douglass was now preparing a voice that could arrive in thousands of homes without him in the room. By placing his life into a bound volume and carrying it across the Atlantic, Douglass turned memory into evidence that could travel without him. In Britain and Ireland, letters, receipts, and introductions widened his circle and reduced the danger that law could reach him so easily. As he returns, the next turning point becomes practical and quiet. A press, type trays, and a room where ink will speak every week. Chapter 7. Rochester and the Press. In December 1847, Rochester was a cold-weather city of brick buildings and narrow streets, with the Genesee River and the Erie Canal shaping commerce. Douglass launched the North Star on December 3, 1847, building an anti-slavery newspaper that also argued for broader civil rights. The office had a press, cases of type, and stacks of paper, and the steady rhythm of printing became a new kind of heartbeat for his life. In this work, he interacted with figures like Martin Delany, a black abolitionist and thinker, who at times worked alongside him, though later accounts differ on exact roles. Douglass also received support from reformers such as Gerrit Smith, whose resources and politics influenced the wider anti-slavery landscape. Letters arrived with folded pages and sealing wax, and Douglass learned to manage alliances through correspondence as much as through speeches. On printing days, the labor was precise and repetitive, and it suited his disciplined mind. Compositors set letters into lines, locked them into a form, inked the surface, and pressed paper against it until the text appeared in readable columns. The smell of oil and ink hung in the room, and the sound of the press lever and the slide of paper made a steady music that did not depend on applause. The newspaper brought a shift in his relationship with William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison favored moral suasion and distrusted political compromise, while Douglass increasingly saw the Constitution as a document that could be argued into anti-slavery meaning. The debate unfolded in editorials, pamphlets, and meetings, with inked columns serving as a battleground of ideas. And Douglass chose independence, even when it cost him friendships. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act intensified danger for freedom seekers and for those who helped them, and Douglass responded with sharper warnings and practical aid. Rochester became a crossroads, and his household, shared with Anna, sometimes assisted people moving north, a fact supported by multiple accounts of Underground Railroad activity in the region. A spare room, a warm meal, and a map folded in a pocket were small objects in a high-stakes journey, and Douglass treated each decision as both moral and practical, knowing that federal warrants and courtroom procedures could reach even a quiet front parlor. The 1850s also brought Douglass into contact with John Brown, a militant abolitionist with a plan for armed resistance. Brown visited Douglass in Rochester, and they discussed strategy, but Douglass did not join the 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, judging it unlikely to succeed. Their meetings took place around tables and papers, where plans were outlined in words rather than in weapons, and the air in such rooms could feel thick with urgency, even when voices stayed controlled. Douglass kept speaking widely, including a major address in 1852 on the meaning of Independence Day in a slave-holding republic, a speech later widely reprinted. He continued to publish, revise, and argue, and he built a reputation as an editor who could connect local events to constitutional questions, with the smell of ink clinging to press sheets. The printed page, with its margins and headings, became his steady instrument, and the calm act of setting type stood beside the more public drama of the lecture platform. By 1860, the nation moved closer to war, and Douglass watched political fractures sharpen. He saw the new Republican Party rise and the old compromises fail, and he prepared for a future where the meaning of freedom would be contested not only in speeches, but in armies and law, with newspapers piling up on his desk. In his office, with a lamp over a writing surface and stacks of correspondence nearby, he kept arranging words as if arranging the future, one line at a time. Chapter 8. War and the White House. In 1861, as the Civil War began, Douglass was in the North with a well-known voice and a deep sense of what the conflict could become. The map of the United States was suddenly marked by battle lines, enlistment offices, and telegram reports, and newspapers carried casualty lists in tight columns. Douglass used his pen and his platform to argue that the war must aim at ending slavery, not merely preserving the Union, and he watched federal policy shift slowly under pressure. He wrote editorials and delivered speeches that urged the enlistment of black men, insisting that military service would strengthen claims to citizenship. The practical work involved recruiting meetings, printed notices, and the sight of uniforms being issued in town halls. In his own family, the stakes were personal, as his sons Lewis Henry Douglass and Charles Remond Douglass enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, and other children also contributed to recruitment and support efforts. In 1863, Douglass met President Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C., entering the White House, where corridors, carpets, and guards marked the center of federal power. The meeting was a political act as much as a personal one, and Douglass pressed for equal treatment of black soldiers and for emancipation to be real in practice. The physical setting, the waiting room, the papers on desks, and the quiet formality of the visit underscored how far he had traveled from a Maryland cabin. Douglass returned again to the White House in 1864, continuing to urge policy that matched principle, including attention to pay and protection for black troops. He also confronted the grim reality of war news, receiving letters and reports that carried the weight of distant camps. In a quiet room with a letter on a table, he had to hold together the public voice of strategy and the private voice of family concern without letting either collapse. As the war moved toward its end, Douglass focused on what would follow. He understood that emancipation without legal rights could become another form of constraint, and he prepared arguments for citizenship, voting, and protection under law. The objects of his trade were again paper and ink, petitions, editorials, and careful language, and the work felt steady even when the nation felt torn. In 1865, with Lincoln assassinated and the country entering a tense transition, Douglass moved into the Reconstruction era with a sharpened sense of urgency. Washington streets, government buildings, and crowded meeting rooms became familiar landscapes as he sought influence in policy debates, with the sound of footsteps in long corridors. The war had opened a door, but the hinges creaked, and Douglass kept his hand on the frame, pushing it wider through words and presence. Chapter 9. Reconstruction Storm. During the war years, Douglass used paper, speeches, and recruiting meetings to push the nation toward emancipation that would be real in law and in daily treatment. He carried his arguments into the White House itself, while letters from camps brought the war into his own family rooms. Now, the story moves into the tense work after the fighting, when constitutional words and government offices will decide what freedom can hold. After 1865, the United States entered Reconstruction, a period of contested lawmaking and uneven enforcement, with military districts in the South and intense debate in Congress. Douglass traveled, wrote, and spoke in support of the 14th and 15th Amendments, treating each clause as a tool that could protect lives if backed by policy. The setting of his work was often a hall with flags, a table with documents, and listeners holding printed programs in quiet hands. He confronted President Andrew Johnson and the lenient approach Johnson favored toward former Confederates, arguing that federal power must defend the rights of freed people. Douglass delivered speeches in Washington and in northern cities, with newspapers reporting on his positions, and he became a visible advocate for black suffrage. The smell of ink on fresh newspapers and the sight of headlines about riots and elections made the struggle feel immediate, even to those far from the South. During these years, Douglass also remained connected to the women's rights movement, which he had supported since the late 1840s. He worked alongside leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, though the period around the 15th Amendment brought fractures, as some activists resisted an amendment that enfranchised black men but not women. Douglass argued that the ballot for black men was an urgent shield in a violent political landscape, while he continued to speak for women, suffrage as a principle. And the debates played out in convention rooms, with tables, paper resolutions, and tired faces in steady indoor light. He found an ally in President Ulysses S. Grant, whose administration supported enforcement measures against violent suppression in the South, though results were mixed and political will shifted. Douglass accepted roles that placed him near federal authority, including service on the Santo Domingo Commission in 1871, which examined a proposed annexation plan in the Caribbean. The commission required travel, interviews, and a formal report, and Douglass approached it as a reader and writer of policy, weighing maps and testimony with an even attention, as if he were editing a dense newspaper column in rooms where the air smelled of ink and sealing wax. In 1872, his home in Rochester was damaged by fire, and he relocated his base of life and work more fully to Washington, D.C., where federal appointments and national advocacy converged. Moving meant trunks, book boxes, and the careful transport of manuscripts, all handled with a sense that the papers mattered as much as furniture. In a new study space, with shelves and a desk, he rebuilt the daily rhythm of writing and meetings. In 1877, Douglass visited Thomas Auld, his former enslaver, on the final days of Auld life, a meeting arranged through family connections according to later accounts. The visit drew criticism from some observers and relief from others, and Douglass treated it as a personal closing of a chapter rather than a public reconciliation statement. The scene, a sick room with a chair beside a bed and quiet indoor light, showed how time could change the balance of power without erasing the past. Chapter 10. Cedar Hill. In 1877, Douglass settled into Washington, D.C. as the center of his public life, a city of broad avenues, government buildings, and crowded streetcars. On September 1, 1877, he purchased a house on a hill in Anacostia and named it Cedar Hill, a large home that he expanded over time. The house had porches, a library space, and rooms for family and guests, and the view toward the city offered a calm distance, especially in quiet afternoon light. That same year, President Rutherford B. Hayes appointed Douglass as U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia, a position that carried symbolism and practical authority. The work involved courtrooms, warrants, and official papers, and it placed him in the machinery of federal law that had once been used to hunt him. In offices with polished desks and stamped documents, Douglass performed duties while also navigating the subtle exclusions of Washington's social life. Anna Murray Douglass was still at his side in these years, managing household rhythms that kept the home steady while he traveled and spoke. The kitchen, the dining table, and the simple routine of laundry and meals formed a quiet foundation under public life, even as visitors came through the front rooms. Their children were grown, including Rosetta Douglass Sprague, and family letters moved between households, with envelopes and seals that carried both affection and logistics. In 1881, Douglass became Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia, another federal appointment that involved public records and the language of property and law. The irony of a former enslaved man overseeing deeds was not lost on observers, and Douglass treated the position as both work and symbol. In an office lined with ledgers, the scratch of pen on paper sounded like a steady counterpoint to the old days when his own name had been written only as an entry in someone else's records. In August 1882, Anna Murray Douglass died, and the home at Cedar Hill shifted into a quieter grief. A bedroom, a folded shawl, and a chair left in place could hold the weight of a long shared life, and Douglass continued speaking engagements while carrying loss. He also returned to his writing, revising autobiographical work that had become a record of national change as much as personal history. In 1884, Douglass married Helen Pitts, a white activist and editor who shared his interest in reform and education. The marriage drew public attention and criticism across racial lines, and Douglass faced it with the same steadiness he had used in other controversies. At Cedar Hill, two people sat at desks and tables with books and correspondence, building a partnership shaped by work as much as by companionship, with the quiet rustle of paper in the rooms. In Washington, Douglass stepped into formal public office, working amid ledgers, stamps, and courtrooms that once would have been instruments against him. Cedar Hill became a steady base where family life, grief, and new controversy lived beside shelves of papers and a writing desk. The next chapter follows him as an older man, still traveling and still answering history in real time, with dispatches, meetings, and printed pages. Chapter 11. Still showing up. In the later 1880s and early 1890s, Douglass remained a traveler and a public figure, even as age changed his pace. Cedar Hill functioned as a base, with a study, shelves of books, and stacks of letters that continued to arrive. The house held the smell of old paper and polished wood, and it also held the steady pattern of guests, meetings, and preparations for the next speech. In 1889, President Benjamin Harrison appointed Douglass as Minister Resident and Consul General to Haiti, a diplomatic role that placed him in complex international politics. He traveled and worked with official dispatches, receptions, and negotiations, and he also confronted prejudice from U.S. observers who doubted a black diplomat. The setting of diplomacy included uniforms, formal rooms, and stamped papers, and Douglass moved through it with practiced control, aware that each appearance would be interpreted as a test. His time connected to Haiti lasted into 1891, and it involved tension around U.S. interests in Caribbean ports and Haitian sovereignty. Douglass wrote and spoke later about the difficulty of representing national policy while also respecting the dignity of Haiti and historians continue to debate some details of these episodes. Through it all, he kept his habits of documentation, keeping copies, notes, and letters with ink lines that preserved what memory alone might distort. Back in Washington, he continued to speak on civil rights and to support reform causes including women's suffrage and black education. He sometimes worked alongside the journalist and activist Ida B. Wells, who was part of a younger generation confronting new forms of racial violence and political retreat. Meeting rooms, pamphlets, and newspaper clippings filled the surfaces of his life, and he remained, in practical terms, a man of paper and public space. In the early 1890s, he revised his autobiography, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, returning to earlier scenes with the calm of an older narrator. The act required arranging manuscripts, checking dates, and deciding what to emphasize, as if editing a long archive. In his study at Cedar Hill, with a lamp on a desk and the sound of pages turning, he continued to shape how the nation would remember the turning points he had lived. On February 20th, 1895, Douglass spent part of the day in Washington engaged with civic life and the ongoing work of reform, including attendance at a meeting connected to women's rights. He returned to Cedar Hill and died there later that day, leaving behind a home filled with books, letters, and the tools of a lifetime of argument. In the rooms of the house, objects remained in place: a pen, a chair, a stack of paper, and the view from the hill toward the city he had pressed so often. Cedar Hill stayed quiet after his death, with shelves that still held bound volumes and drawers that still held correspondence. The story does not end with a single closing sentence in his own work, because he had always treated public life as ongoing, a matter of showing up again and again. So we leave him there, not in a monument, but in a house where paper rests on wood, where the ink has dried, and where the evening air over Washington feels steady and ordinary.